Okay, welcome. I have a lot to cover today. I had originally thought about including some John Stuart Mill along with the Gibbon, but it turns out that the Gibbon material is sufficiently extensive. That is all that we are going to have time to do in today's lecture. All right. I told you at the outset that the categories that I was using to divide the various kinds of skepticism were sometimes categories of convenience rather than very close resemblance. And this is perhaps the best illustration of all of the ones that we'll be treating, because urbane skepticism comes in various forms. I've used it as a kind of collective name for a sort of English skepticism that is cool, not the least bit reverential, and yet also not exuding the kind of hostility that you find eminently in Rousseau, certainly in the populist skeptics, nor the kind of cold hatred of a Strauss, but rather the cool, detached, sometimes ironic view of someone like Gibbon. Although we'll see that in the case of Matthew Arnold, we have to modify that description a bit. There are some recurring themes, and as we go through this unit, I want you to keep some of these in mind. There are some methodological issues, particularly the following, most of which were raised by David Hume in his essay Of Miracles in 1748. There's the question of the qualification of the witnesses. Hume says at the beginning of part 2 of that essay that they must be of unquestioned good sense and education. They can't be ignorant. They must not be credulous. They must have an appropriate amount of skepticism, where an appropriate amount is defined as the amount that Hume or Gibbon would be inclined to bring to the question. They should be people of reputation rather than of obscurity. They should be sincere rather than having an interest in having their story believed. There's a question of discrepancies in narratives and in testimony. At any time that we're asked to take a report at second or third or fourth hand of a supernatural event as an evidence of it, questions arise regarding how we should evaluate that testimony. Usually we have a written narrative of the testimony, and if there are discrepancies in the way that details are reported, we have to ask ourselves, what should we say with respect to these discrepancies? Some touches of that you will find coming across here among the urbane skeptics, but for the heaviest weight reposed on this one, you will have to wait until we look at the populists and at Strauss, who are absolute masters of raking together everything that can with any plausibility be said to be a discrepancy or a contradiction. But there's also one other kind of evidence, and here we are going to see that Gibbon is one of the first people to bring this up and really lay great weight on it, and that is the argument from silence. At the end of chapter 15, if you made your way all the way through the required reading there to the end of it and saw what he does, you'll remember that he lays a sort of ironic stress on the fact that there is no report among the philosophers of the pagan world of the darkness at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. We'll come back to that point at the end of this lecture. So, as I said, urbane skepticism is largely an English phenomenon and relies more on irony and disguised critique than the vicious satire and enmity of a Voltaire. Dodwell and Hume are good examples of it from within the deist controversy. Gibbon is our target today. We'll be looking at him. Later urbane skeptics include Mill and Arnold, and when we get to Arnold, you'll see someone who sincerely believes that he is defending what is good and defensible in Christianity, though he's viewed by all of its traditional defenders as an inimical adversary. Edward Gibbon, born in 1737, died in 1794, was an English historian and a member of Parliament. He wrote a 6-volume history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which was justly praised for its style and a great deal of learning that went into it. He was raised Protestant, but scandalizing his father, he converted for a while to Catholicism. His father threatened to disinherit him, upon which point Gibbon thought better of the matter and reconverted to Protestantism, but then sometime not too long thereafter left Christianity altogether, at least in his opinions, if not in his public pronouncements. In the 15th chapter, and to some extent also the 16th chapter of his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in the year of the American Revolution, he lays out an account of how Christianity arose and prospered. He does not attempt directly to attack Christianity. And there's a quotation here from Henry Hart Millman that I think is revealing. This is from his own notes to his edition of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He says, "The art of Gibbon, or at least the unfair impression produced by these two memorable chapters, consists in confounding together in one indistinguishable mass the origin and apostolic propagation of the Christian religion with its later progress. The main question, the divine origin of the religion, is dexterously eluded or speciously conceded. His plan enables him to commence his account in most parts below, that is, later than, the apostolic times, and it is only by the strength of the dark coloring with which he has brought out the failings and follies of succeeding ages that a shadow of doubt and suspicion is thrown back on the primitive period of Christianity." Most later critics have concurred, at least in this much of what Millman has to say. It's interesting to note that Gibbon was himself influenced, as he says in an autobiographical piece, by a work of Conyers Middleton called A Free Inquiry into the Miraculous Powers that were said to have subsisted in the age of the Apostolic Fathers. So we'll have a look at that. There is some dispute as to the extent of the influence of Middleton and the timing of that influence, but that he was familiar with it and indeed mentions it is not in dispute. We will see it in a footnote to our own work here. So here's a broad overview of what he does in chapter 15. He says that the early progress of Christianity was facilitated by 5 secondary causes. The primary causes he concedes with one hand, but there's a sort of ironic lifted eyebrow as he does this about the miraculous founding of it. But the melancholy duty of the historian is to trace out the secondary causes. And he reduces these under 5 heads. The intolerant zeal of the Christians, which he says was naturally derived from the intolerant zeal of the Jews. The doctrine the Christians had of a future life, which commended their religion to the Romans, who were concerned about what the future might hold for them, and offered something more than Judaism offered, since Judaism does not have a very fully developed doctrine of a future life. Third, the miraculous powers ascribed, note that verb there, to the primitive church. That is to say, the church in later ages said that it had miraculous powers and that these extended backward in time to the time of its founding. Fourth, the pure and austere morals of the Christians, and finally the union and discipline of the Christian Republic, which grew up within the Roman Empire to the point where it was in fact in all of the cities of the Roman Empire and acquired dominant sway in the time of Constantine, when it became, if not exactly the official religion, at least officially tolerated, sanctioned, and patronized. Now, it's very interesting to note the way that Gibbon goes about his task here. He never makes a frontal assault on the evidences of Christianity, though by this time the literature of the deist controversy lay in everyone's full view. And so he could, had he chosen, have tried to join issue with someone like Leland or Lardner, who had laid out so much in the defense of Christianity in their interactions with people like Tyndall and Bolingbroke. But he never does that. He's never engaged directly with the question of the truth of Christianity. His attack is always an indirect attack, and that's what allows him to keep up this polite facade of disinterested historical inquiry. The same year that Gibbon was born, Richard Watson was born. There are 2 Richard Watsons in our database. This one is the one that we are concerned with here. The other is a Methodist minister of great learning who flourished a bit later in the 19th century. Watson went to school with William Paley, and became Bishop of Llandaff in Wales. He's well known for two principal works that have lasted and been influential. One of them was the Apology for Christianity, which was his direct response to Gibbon, issued in the same year that Gibbon wrote the first volume of his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The second is an apology for the Bible, which is a response to Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, Part 2. There's a very interesting dynamic that goes on in the way that Watson engages with these two writers. Gibbon is a scholar and a man of learning, and Watson approaches him with a sort of genteel, gracious swordsmanship in which he lets it be known that he knows what Gibbon's really trying to do, but he never rashly accuses him of things. He's very careful in the way that he handles that. Not all of Gibbon's respondents did that. In fact, the vast majority of them accused him of a very serious and significant attack on Christianity and were scandalized by it. So Watson's more genteel engagement with Gibbon earned him this much respect, that when Gibbon wrote a response to almost all of the people who had attacked his chapter 15, he does not respond to two people. Watson is one of them, and in fact his secretary sent a polite note to Watson, and the other was Lord Hales, David Dalrymple, the Scottish jurist, who had written a very minute examination of Gibbon, rather dry, but going through every footnote, every reference, and finding numerous cases in which Gibbon had at least shaded the truth, if not outright misrepresented things that were going on there. So let's look at Watson's assessment of Gibbon's five causes. First, the intolerant zeal of the Christians. Gibbon attributes that zeal to the influence of Judaism, and he gives a very unfavorable description of Judaism. You'll note on page 268 of the edition that we're looking at, footnote number 3, it has a very sarcastic description of Maimonides, and on pages 270 and 271 he portrays the Jewish people as being highly irrational, turning aside from the prodigies worked by Moses with careless indifference, but then in later ages being fanatically devoted to the memory of these prodigies. So he's clearly has a low opinion of the Jews that might actually fairly be said to be anti-Semitic. Watson instead attributes their zeal to their full persuasion of the truth in their religion. And he supports this by two non-miraculous facts reported in the primary sources. First, he says that zeal derived from the unsocial spirit of Judaism would not and could not have inspired Peter to deliver his impassioned speech on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And it also would not have inspired Peter and John to defy the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 4. So the two non-miraculous accounts that we have there in Acts 2 and Acts 4 of what was actually preached by Peter and defiantly said by Peter and John cannot really be well explained by a Jewish zeal or a zeal derived from Judaism. That's rather a different cause. Note that it's interesting that Watson does not reach for miraculous events. He well knows that Gibbon would find some clever way of insinuating that he disbelieves the miraculous accounts, so instead he goes for some non-miraculous facts attested in those primary sources. Watson goes a little bit further, and he doesn't press this too hard, but I think he wants to get the point out there. He says that this is also an argument for the truth of their convictions. Here's what he says: when a man suffers himself to be covered with infamy, pillaged of his property, and dragged at last to the block or the stake, rather than give up his opinion, the proper inference is not that his opinion is true, but that he believes it to be true. And a question of serious discussion immediately presents itself: upon what foundation has he built his belief? Now, of course, he's referring to the conduct of the original apostles, and Paley, in his view of the evidences of Christianity, also makes reference to this. In fact, you'll find something to this effect at the head of every chapter in part 1 of Paley's Evidences. But you'll also remember that there was that French Protestant cloth merchant, Jean Calas, whose conduct under torture and torture to death attracted the defense of Voltaire. What Watson gives here as a description is also a description of Calas. And so it's fair to say that Watson may have that in mind, and knowing the influence of French writers, and the philosophes in particular, upon Gibbon, he may be bringing this up very delicately as a way of saying, you yourself know that when someone is enduring under threat of torture and even death, this carries great evidential significance. It certainly persuaded Voltaire. How about the doctrine of a future life? Again, Gibbon says that this would have been attractive to the Romans, who had some heritage from the Greeks of a hope for a future life, but without much detail to it. But Watson retorts with a slightly finer grained examination of the doctrine of the future life, and he says even the Romans who did believe in an afterlife didn't think that it would contain punishments for the wicked, and such rewards as they would have thought of would have been more along the lines of what Muhammad produces in the Quran rather than what the Christians taught. To suppose that the afterlife was a place that was not devoted to the gratification of sensual pleasure, was a place where vengeance would have no place, a place where the manly virtues of courage would be subordinated to the gentler virtues of honesty and love that the Christians promoted, was not a description calculated to attract the attention of a Roman audience. It is true that they discussed among their philosophers the immortality of the soul as a theoretical idea, but Watson points out rather shrewdly that the central fact in the Christian view of the afterlife is not simply the existence of the disembodied soul, it's the resurrection of the body. And the response that Paul received on Mars Hill, as soon as he brings up that word anastasis, as soon as he speaks of resurrection, is what they might have expected. That is, that he gets a polite hearing until that point, and at that point he's derided and mocked, and many of them will hear no more of it. So the doctrine of a future life in the abstract sounds like it would be something that would attract them. But once we note what they were looking for in a future life and what they were not looking for, we recognize that if any such doctrine were to have been tailored to attract their attention and their allegiance, the Christian doctrine would not be anything like it. How about the imminent end of the world? We still hear, of course, in modern times, the objection that Jesus was a failed eschatological prophet, that the idea that he would come back within the lifetime of his apostles and the end of the world, in the Jewish sense, would take place, disproves his divine commission. Now, Gibbon doesn't use it that way as a direct assault. Instead, he suggests that the urgency of the Christian message, the sky is falling, the world is about to end, would have made their message more persuasive. And then he adds this little sarcastic comment that the revolution of 17 centuries has instructed us not to press too closely the mysterious language of Revelation. Watson's not impressed, and he offers several lines of rejoinder. One is that John, in the book of Revelation, cannot be accused of thinking that the world was coming to an end within his own lifetime, because he has described many things that are descriptions that would come to fruition only much later in history. Peter, 2 Peter 3:4, intimates that it might be 1,000 years hence, right? 1,000 years is as a day with the Lord. So the idea that Peter is promoting is that, yes, we have to be vigilant, but that vigilance, as we read even in the Old Testament, Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 2, is a vigilance that we may have to wait for. Paul, in 2 Timothy, says that he is at the end of his life, so he doesn't think he'll live to see the coming end of the age, and he rebukes the Thessalonians for the desertion of the normal activities of life, as you can see in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 2. Now, an interesting point about this strand of response that Watson gives is that every one of the books that he has referred to is of contested authorship today. The authorship was widely granted in his time and Gibbon's time. So as an argument to Gibbon, it was perfectly forceful without any further defense of the premises. But the question of the authorship of these books themselves is now one that will become more urgent. So this kind of response, telling though it was on the premises that Gibbon and Watson would have shared, is a response that would now require further substantiation. How about the miraculous powers ascribed to the primitive church? Gibbon's idea here is that a church that can awe its prospective converts by claims to miraculous powers in the present age or in past ages is a church that has ready to hand a weapon of conversion of no small power. After all, if you tell people that your church contains the power to bring the dead back to life, to heal the sick, and to work other such wonders, that's fairly awe-inspiring. But Watson, again, is a little bit more skeptical of Gibbon's argument, and he rejoins that all such powers were attributed in their very own time to the Catholic Church, and in Catholic countries it was even backed by the sword of the civil magistrate. And yet, in those countries, no doubt he had France in mind, Christianity is nearly extinguished. In such countries, Christianity, far from flourishing under the spell and power of an ascription of miraculous powers to the primitive church, is actually languishing. And as we know, in the French Revolution, a few decades after this point, it was actually abolished for a time. So it's very difficult to see how the mere pretension to miraculous powers, and that within a church hardly so well established as the Roman Catholic Church was at this time, could have been the cause of its flourishing among the pagans. The pagans seem to have responded with very little interest to Christian miracle claims, often attributing them to jugglery or to the intervention of infernal powers. Of course, a common Jewish objection to Jesus' mighty works was that he cast out demons by the prince of the demons, and he was in league with the devil, and that was the reason that he could do these things. And there was also some attempt to make parallels to them. So in the life of Apollonius of Tyana, a sage whose lifespan was supposed to have corresponded roughly with that of the Apostle John to the end of the 1st century, Philostratus in the 3rd century writes a life of Apollonius, and in that life he attributes to him many of the same abilities that Jesus has. He can speak, and that Jesus' apostles have. He can speak in tongues, he can shake off fetters, he can heal the blind, he can raise the dead, he comes back to life, and so forth. Pretty obviously, in the case of Philostratus, an attempt to make parallels to claims that the Christians made in their own scriptures. So coming later than their scriptures and written as a deliberate attempt to one-up them with a pagan sage. But in none of these cases were the bare claims to miraculous powers very influential, and so that does not seem to be as cogent a reason as Gibbon would have us think. Of course, if they actually had the powers to do these things, that's another matter. Now, Watson is what we would call today a cessationist. He doesn't think that the miraculous powers extended beyond the death of the apostles. But he makes a very shrewd comment at one point. He says, look, if you thought that there really had been miraculous powers given to the apostles for the purpose of the founding of the church in the very first age of the church, and that those had ceased, what would you expect in succeeding ages? Almost inevitably, there would be a bunch of people who, whether out of desire for power and gain or out of sincere self-delusion, would claim that they also had those powers. So it's not at all surprising that we should see claims to them. But Watson believes the evidence for it in the first age, the primitive age, the founding of the church, is better, more solid than the evidence in later. That question, of course, had already been raised by Hume in his essay of miracles. In the second part of it, he lays out several miraculous claims which he expects his Protestant readers to disbelieve, attributed to the Emperor Vespasian and to the application of holy oil in Saragossa in Spain, and to the tomb of the Abbé Pérez, a Jansenist leader in Paris. And he says, hey, look, all of these things you don't believe in, yet we have very good evidence for these things, better evidence than we have, the insinuation is, for any of the miracles reported in the New Testament. And of course, a good chunk of the response to Hume, as in Adams and Campbell and Douglas, is a response to that particular claim. So those of you who are interested in going back and seeing how that was dealt with should have a look at William Adams' essay in answer to Mr. Hume's essay on miracles, or Campbell's dissertation on miracles, or John Douglas's book, The Criterion. On miracles more generally, Gibbon on page 311, note 79, cites Conyers Middleton's free inquiry, but he misdescribes it. He cites it as an attack on miracle claims in the primitive church. Now, unless the word primitive is being wrested away from its obvious meaning, this is just a mistake. Middleton does not profess to go back before the group of people called the Apostolic Fathers. That is, he doesn't profess to proceed back beyond the 2nd century to the 1st. So his attack, though it may have been intended to suggest that there were problems in the evidencing of miracle claims in the primitive church, does not actually go back there. There was a literature on the question of how to distinguish spurious miracle claims from true miracle claims. And so Charles Leslie's Short and Easy Method with a Deist, published very late in the 17th century, 1698, I believe, is a good example of a work that lays out criteria for distinguishing miracle claims that may reasonably be doubted from those to which we ought to give our assent. Douglas's book, The Criterion, is entirely devoted to this question and picks up Hume's claims of such miracles simply as part of the task of distinguishing between them. And the arguments of people like Leslie and Douglas would be used in later controversy as well. So keep them in mind, and as we read, say, Matthew Arnold, you'll see him dropping in a reference to Leslie, or as we read Mill, you'll see him refer to Campbell. And it's very important that we understand that these were references to disputes already well underway. Watson takes a slightly different line. Instead of simply retailing what's been said by these other defenders, he says, look, what you're saying, in effect, is that we should reject a miraculous narrative on the ground that we're unfamiliar with the cause. But that principle, if we were to use it elsewhere, would block the progress of science. We would not be able to say that magnetism has the effects that it does because we were previously unfamiliar with it. So we would be debarred from admitting a new kind of cause since it doesn't lie within our experience. John Stuart Mill later tries to refine this kind of argument that Gibbon is giving, and we'll see with what success or lack of success he does this when we talk more about Mill. So there's a forward connection to some later literature on this particular kind of argument. It's really interesting that this kind of rejoinder is at the heart of John Earman's book, Hume's Abject Failure, published in the year 2000, I believe. And Earman says basically Hume's argument, if it were to be taken seriously, would be a science stopper. So Earman, though he has no particular religious beliefs, is very critical of this attempt to just shut down discussion with a broad principle of that kind. There's one other amusing footnote to this. The famous French scientist Laplace mounted a campaign against the identification of certain rocks exhibited in museums as aerolites, what we would today call meteorites. And he actually got the museums, many of them, to throw out their collections of meteorites on the ground, that there's no known reason that rocks should fall from the sky, and the reports of them come from peasants, and peasants are credulous and uneducated. So there's if you want an exhibit of the mode of reasoning that Gibbon is enjoining here, there it is, ambulando, as we say. There you can see it, walking before your very eyes. Laplace getting museums to throw out supposed meteorites because they can't really exist, because we know of no reason rocks should fall from the sky, and peasants, after all, who should take them seriously? I love that example. How about the pure and austere morals of the Christians? No doubt the Christians had pure and austere morals. No doubt also sometimes some of them failed to live up to the standard of the rest of the community. As far as proselytizing, and that's the way in which Gibbon wants to make use of it, it's really a badly designed tool. The state of the pagan world was exceedingly degraded at this time. Celebration of rites within the temples involved ritual prostitution. This was supposed to be your religious duty. There were many violent things, the games where people were torn apart by wild animals and so forth. That is hardly the kind of environment into which you should come preaching pure and austere morals and expect to receive a good hearing. Gibbon insinuates in a footnote, I've given you the reference here, that the Christians engaged in sexual orgies. He gets this insinuation in a rather sly way. He points out that some of the early Christians appear to have had some goods in common, and then he puts in a footnote to Plato and says that community of goods and community of women may be considered as inseparable. So much for the pure morals of the Christians. If Gibbon's insinuation be taken seriously, there is, of course, no ground whatsoever for that. And yet, in an odd sort of way, there's something related to Gibbon's claim here that may actually have been one of the causes for the spread of Christianity, and that is their treatment of children who were exposed on mountaintops. It was quite common in the pagan world for a family who didn't want a child, perhaps because the child was a girl, perhaps because the child was born with some deformity like a cleft palate or a clubfoot, to go and set the child out on the hills and let wild animals come and take it away. If not that, then simply throwing newborn infants into the sewers was another method of disposal. We have unearthed Roman cities where the sewers are clogged with the bones of newborn infants, a very gruesome spectacle. The Christians, and this was widely known from the earliest times, abhorred these practices, and they would go out at nighttime on the mountaintops and search for the children. Now, an effect of this would be immediate demographic growth. When you have an entire community spread out around the empire, so committed to attempting to save the lives of helpless infants that they take them in and raise them as their own, they're going to have a very big next generation, and very largely communicate their morals and their values to that generation. So although this wasn't the intent of Gibbon in raising this, there may be something to this particular secondary cause in the fact that the Christians engaged in practices that were merciful, put them under some economic strain, but also provided for really spectacular demographic growth within a generation. And finally, the union and discipline of the Christian Republic. Here, I think, is again a case where Millman's observation that Gibbon is sliding over the difference between the very first age of the church and later ages is a fair one. In the earliest ages of the church, look at the difficulties that Paul has struggling with the church at Corinth. Note the way that he has to express himself in both of his letters, both of which, by the way, are acknowledged even by fairly skeptical scholars as undenied epistles of Paul. It's obvious that unity and discipline was not a hallmark of the church at the very outset. So, yes, early in the 4th century, at the time of Constantine, it became quite unified. And even late in the 2nd century, there was more structure and more unity to it. But in the primitive ages, not so much. So I think that Watson's assessment of Gibbon's causes is largely fair and undermines, to a very large extent, Gibbon's attempt to give an account of the rise of Christianity in the complete absence of anything supernatural about its origin. There's one more thing I want to draw your attention to, and this comes in the last few pages of chapter 15. So congratulations to you if you made it all the way to the end of that rather protracted bit of reading. Here's what Gibbon has to say about the darkness that was supposed to have overspread the land at the time of the crucifixion of Jesus. It happened, he says, during the lifetime of Seneca and the elder Pliny, who must have experienced the immediate effects or received the earliest intelligence of the prodigy. Each of these philosophers, notice the use of philosopher here in the older sense of natural philosopher, someone interested in the sciences and in natural events. Each of these philosophers, in a laborious work, has recorded all the great phenomena of nature, earthquakes, meteors, comets, and eclipses, which his indefatigable industry could collect. Ponder that for a minute. A laborious work. All the great phenomena, which his indefatigable industry could collect. What is Gibbon suggesting to you about the types of works that Seneca and Pliny have left behind? Both the one and the other have omitted to mention the greatest phenomenon to which mortal eye has been witness since the creation of the globe. Now, in order to give it this description, Gibbon must be insinuating that the darkness, which is said to have overspread the land, and that phrase is used elsewhere simply for Palestine or Judea itself as a sub-portion of Palestine, but he is insinuating that this must have been worldwide and that the whole world must have been plunged into utter darkness. Neither of those assumptions can, I think, be wrung out of the passages in the 3 Gospels that report the darkness. A distinct chapter of Pliny is devoted to eclipses of an extraordinary nature and unusual duration. But he contents himself with describing the singular defect of light which followed the murder of Caesar, when during the greatest part of the year the orb of the sun appeared pale and without splendor. Here we see an argument from silence on display in a very transparent form. If the event had really occurred, Seneca and Pliny could not have failed to mention it. But they do not mention it, therefore the event did not occur. Therefore the Gospels are not giving us a factual account of something that actually happened in space and time. Therefore, we are at liberty to discount, to whatever extent this allows us, the narratives of the Gospels as containing at least some fictitious material, and now we know not how much, and so we are at liberty to take them lightly. That, I think, is a reasonable summary of Gibbon's argument. Let's have a look at the factual basis for it. Seneca doesn't mention eclipses or darknesses at all in the chapter to which Gibbon refers. In fact, his work is primarily concerned with earthquakes, and he's not so much concerned to pull them all together in one great list as to talk about their causes. That seems to be what Seneca is looking for there. So he talks about 5 or 6 of them. But the worst of it is that the distinct chapter of Pliny is 18 words long in Latin. Here's a complete translation of that distinct chapter. Unusually long, portentous eclipses of the sun also take place, as when Caesar the dictator was slain, and in the war against Antony the sun remained dim for nearly a year. End of chapter. That's the entire chapter of Pliny. If you feel deceived, I think you have a right to feel deceived. Such is Gibbon's way of handling the facts as an adversary rather than as an impartial judge. And in fairness to Mill, I will say this, that although Mill has no sympathy for Christianity or any other revealed religion, he does not do things like this. And you can well understand why Gibbon was taken to have been deliberately modifying the truth in his attempt to mount an attack on the Christian religion.